Hello. I've got setting up multi-stream today, or at least trying multi-stream. So if you join from Twitch today, I will be checking in at some point, but I haven't got the chats merged yet, so just a little bit of an experiment more than anything for today. So I'll mostly be checking the YouTube chat because that's mostly where we exist. But worth a try occasionally. Worth a try. But it took me long enough to get to the point where I could multi-stream last night, and I thought trying to work out how to merge the chats was going to be too much extra work. Oh, it says it's failed to connect to server anyway, so I'll try that again another time. But it is not a high priority right now. Hi, everyone. This is like a little regular thing where we do a talk on a particular subject. I might not be doing one of these next month just because we've got the jam running next month. So on a game jam month, I imagine I'll be focused very much on making something for the game jam or answering people's questions about game jam related stuff as we go through. Because it is a sort of music focused game jam, maybe I will do more content about music during August. Yeah, Twitch thinks I'm offline because the plugin didn't work, but I'll sort that out another time. And yeah, today we are thinking about level design approaches for indie devs. And it took me a while to kind of get this presentation together because I wanted to make sure it was going to be particularly relevant for people who watch this channel, people who are working on their own game. And what I didn't want to do is just reproduce loads of level design tips from other places. So this is a little bit more meta than that. As you've probably come to expect from me, it's not just here's how to make a level. That's kind of not what we're going to be focused on this time. So let me just... Okay, so we're not going to be doing how to design levels. There will be some stuff about that in here. I will be going through some tips on how to design levels, but it's not the main focus. The main focus is... wicked. Hi, Erdkash. The main focus here is how to interpret the advice that you get on level design as a game designer or a solo developer, because so much of the game design content or the level design content out there is not presented in the context of you are making an indie game and you've made the game yourself and now you need to make the levels yourself. It is much more along the lines of, you know, preparing you to become a level designer at a AAA studio or something like that. And that's not very helpful for this channel or the audience of this channel, because you know, level design advice that says, first you must understand the game mechanics. And it's like, well, I haven't designed the game yet. That kind of thing. That's not helpful for us, because a lot of us were making games on our own, or we're in a small team where we're playing like a role where we do lots of different things. We need to understand how level design and the level design workflow fits into the broader idea of making the whole game, rather than just treating level design as its own discipline. And so, yeah, I'll be talking about how to approach level design in your games. Not just as a sort of how do you put your levels together, but what is level design in your game, all of that kind of stuff. So as an indie developer, you're going to need to do these kind of things. I just realized that the chat is not updating, so I'll just turn it off. As a indie developer, you need to do all of these things. You need to experiment with your game to establish what the level design requirements are in the first place before you do too much level design. You need to work out a top level content plan for your game's levels, and I'll give you an example of that is in another YouTube talk that probably watch it after this, because I think it's one of the best examples I've seen of someone talking about level design in the context of like being a solo developer and making their own game. And you need to sort of establish a strategy for sort of how what you're making in which order. These are all of the sorts of things that you need to think about as an indie developer. If you were a level designer in a big studio, you might be able to just get away with getting given a brief and just making some levels. And then maybe you would have a team lead that set the top level idea of like, how many levels are we making? What's the difference between them? All of that kind of stuff. You have to be all of those people in your own game. So that's the kind of approach we're taking today. And side note before we start is that although you know everything I've just said about how indie developers have to do everything, there are still plenty of places where you can practice level design without making a whole game. I don't know if you also follow Steve Lee, who is a level designer who has a fantastic YouTube channel. And quite frankly, his channel is one of the reasons why I didn't make this talk just be a bunch of level design tips, because why get them from me when you can get them from a proper level designer? But he talks about this quite a lot on his channel. If you go back 20 years or so ago, a lot of us got into level design or even general game design through editors for games. So, you know, I got into... I did a little bit of programming when I was a kid, but a lot of what I did while I was a teenager was using the Warcraft 3 editor, using editors for games like Half-Life and Duke Nukem and stuff like that. And I would say the majority of what I did that contributed to me becoming a game designer later on was level design. And within that, I would try and bend the rules of the game. You know, I would make Warcraft levels that were different genres of game and stuff like that. And that's how we got games like Dota, was people being experimental and doing game design with that level editor. And then like recent jobs, if we kind of fast forward to like 2 or 3 years ago, I was working at a studio that made Roblox experiences, that made Fortnite experiences. These are all the kind of tools that you don't need to actually use a conventional game engine or make a whole game to practice level design. So Quake 3 level editor, yeah, that's another classic one. There are loads of people who have jobs in design that aren't even level designers anymore, that are like general game developers or something like that started off in these engines. And I think one of the things, this is me being an old man now, but I think one of the shames about the current game dev space is a lot of the time, if you go to work on a team and they use Unity or Unreal, you're working in Unity or Unreal. You're not working in like a proprietary tool that the studio has programmed for you to make content for that game. And in a lot of ways, that can make things a lot messier than just saying, look, we've made the game, here's the level editor for it, make content in the level editor. No says level design has killed my project many times. Well, hopefully some of this will help you out. And I'm going to run through lots of different approaches. Again, they're not about how the specifics of how to build a level. They're more about how to think about level design and how to approach it within the context of being an indie developer. And I will look back at the chat at various points and look for questions, but I've also put in a dedicated break for that towards the end before we do a refresher on some of the stuff we've talked about. So, some really common problems that I see are these are common problems with level design content. And Dark Dax, sorry to pick on you. You have a very well produced channel. You're very entertaining. Your videos are very well edited, and by and large, you know what you're talking about. But this video, for example, is not about level design. It is a video that is about environmental art and the technical aspects of environmental art. It's about things like occlusion culling and not loading in things when they're behind doors. These 12 level design tips to optimize your indie game, they're very good tips, but they are not level design. They are environmental art, and they are to do with the technical side of building an environment. He also keeps referring to what he's doing as world building, which is very frustrating as well, because world building is already a technical term from fiction, where it's to do with like the world that you're building through like meaning, not like physically putting trees and doors into an environment. That's not world building, or at least it might feel like world building, but world building is already a technical term within media for something specific. So I'm using this Dark Dax video as an example, but there is a lot of kind of bad information out there about what level design is. And because a lot of us, when we first come to game development, we need to learn the technicals, we have this misinformation about what design is generally. So we have misinformation about game design, where people think that game design is technically building something in a game engine. And this video is an example of that applied to level design. They think level design is putting the things in the level editor or in the game engine, and it's not really, especially when it comes to the kind of art side of stuff. So to give you a better example, there is this blog about game design basics that I'm going to refer to a couple of times that someone in the Discord gave me about a week ago, and I think it really is a fantastically short, clear introduction to many of the misunderstandings about what level design is, and like common issues with level design. So level design is about the functionality and the gameplay. Art is about making it coherent and attractive. We've got an example of what some environmental art is over here. We've got an example of level design over here. Now, there are obviously there are some reasons to make your level beautiful early on. And if we think back to the early examples I talked about with these kind of level editors, when you made a level in one of these older level editors, you couldn't really greybox it. You could still work in a methodical way. You could make the geology first and then put the rocks and trees and details on it, and then put other things on it. You could still work in a methodical way. And the point of this distinction that we make between doing an art stage and a greyboxing stage, I think the important thing is not to take it too literally, and instead to see the point of the process. And the point of the process is to be methodical so that you don't create problems for yourself later on. And the example problem here would be, if you make this environment and you beautify it before you've playtested it thoroughly, then any kind of changes you need to make to that environment to move things around later on are going to become much more difficult, because you're dealing with way more objects. You're just making your work harder for yourself in order to iterate on this later on if you need to change it. And one of the biggest rules in game development, one of the most important rules in game development, is that you want to keep your iteration cycles as short as possible. So anything that you do in your project that slows you down changing things and improving them in some way, because, you know, either you've got an emotional attachment to the thing and you don't want to change it, or you've just added more objects and you need to physically move them, whatever it is, anything that slows down your iteration process before you've got to the point where you know that the game is good and you are going to continue working on it is a problem. And that's a general game development principle. And the kind of grey boxing process is just that principle applied to level design. Is that, you know, you keep things as simple as possible early on, because if you over polish them, if you overproduce them, it's going to be harder and slower to change them later on. And because game development is an iterative process, you don't want to do that. You want to keep your iteration loops quick and short. So this is the kind of response that some of you are likely to be feeling to all of this, is that, you know, I have to do everything myself. I'm a solo developer, or I'm in a small team. So there's no separation between these things. There's no separation between level design and environmental art, because when you're working on your own, you have to do everything. And that's kind of how some people are likely to feel about this, right? There's a really good talk by Lost Relic Games about system-driven level design, and here he basically just talks about exactly what I've been describing of, you know, what happened to him when he put too much effort into the specifics of levels too early on and then had to go back and do everything again. So this is a really much better, much more specific talk than what I'm going to give today. And I've put links to everything I cite here in the description here, so you can go back through them and you can watch them. But I think this is one of the best kind of devlogs about this issue that you can watch. Lost Relic Games video about what happens if you don't separate your level design out into stages and approach it methodically. But there are also reasons why we do this, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge them. So the obvious cons of prematurely polishing a level, doing environmental art at the same time as level design are the things I just talked about. If you add lots of assets, it makes it harder to undo or change things. And this is bad in game development because you can't iterate as quickly. It also means that you get an unhelpful emotional attachment to things, and you get sunk cost fallacy, and you're unlikely to change things even if they need changing. These are the reasons we don't want to work in this kind of haphazard doing everything at the same time kind of way. But we also have to acknowledge this, and this is kind of part of the angle I try to come at this channel from generally, is to sort of have empathy with the sorts of people that watch this channel, is you need to work out the art style for your game and the pipelines anyway. You need to work out what a tree looks like. You need to work out what a rock looks like. So why not put it in a level? This is the kind of attitude that lots of us will have. And also, the other thing is that it's rewarding and keeps you motivated. And this is not talked about so much, but it is very, very important for developers that are working alone, developers that don't have a manager or a producer breathing down their neck. You have to do things that keep you motivated. And I think the trick is to just be wary of what the balance is of things you're doing because they're enjoyable and things you're doing for the benefit of the project. So the way I try to work when I'm building one of my own games is maybe on like a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio of 2 or 3 things that the game needs and 1 thing that you're doing just for fun. But if that thing you're doing just for fun is causing these other problems, like, you're prematurely polishing the thing and you're making a mess for yourself later on, then maybe do something else for fun. A werewolf, I'm not going to spend too much time on that point, but I have played a lot of games recently that did this marketing first approach to development. And so a werewolf in the chat just said you need a visual prototype for advertising. That's true to some degree. And one of the things that we do in larger teams is we do parallel prototypes, right? So there's this idea of marketing first game development at the moment, which is like you show people the game, you show people assets, you make it beautiful, and you do that in order to gauge whether people like the game. And that makes total sense. And it's also one of the reasons why in traditional game studios or any media production studio, they have concept art. So you can show people the thing without building it. So concept art in the context of a game is like, we can show you an animation of a character, but we're not putting it in the game engine yet and making it do stuff. Lots of people seem to have taken on board this advice to do marketing first game development. And I think it is a good approach for established developers. I think if you are a new developer working on your first game and you don't really have proof of concept and you don't really know whether what you're making is up to scratch, I think it can lead to some very bad places. And if you saw me lose it last week at that Pokemon type game, that was exactly where that was coming from. The idea of making a beautiful prototype to show people to get them excited about the game is a good route to go down if you already know how to make games and you've made games in the past, you know that you're technically capable, you know that you can deliver on the promise of what you're doing. But if it's your first game, please don't do that. If it's your first game, please concentrate on making it fun, concentrate on making it operational first. Do not do a beautiful visual prototype for advertising if it is your first game, because it will lead to you making a game that isn't as good as it looks, and it will be very poor. And this channel is not about encouraging everyone to make a game and release it commercially. It is about encouraging people who are already doing that to make better games. So be wary of that advice about marketing-led game development, because it is leading people to make some really terrible stuff, as far as I can see at the moment. But to come back to this point of, why we do these two things, the thing that you just really have to accept is that any game is a combination of these two forces. It requires messy creative experimentation, and it requires strategic structured approaches. And a game that is all massive creative experimentation will probably never get finished. and if it does get finished, it might end up being a total mess. And a game that is all strategic, structured approaches with none of this messy creative stuff is likely to be dull, boring, have nothing unique about it, and just be a copy clone of something else. And this is just the reality. There is no way that you can systematize out the need to do this messy stuff. And if you don't have some sense of strategic, structured approaches, then your mess will be so messy that it stops being creative and just becomes a mess, I guess. I made a micro poem. But the good news is that we already have strategies for these sorts of things. There is a concept in sort of level and environment design called beautiful corners. Don't know if anyone's heard this term before, but a beautiful corner is basically, you've been making everything in grey box. You've been making the functional prototype of the game. You've been making things in grey box. Maybe you've got some concept art, and then a beautiful corner is like one tiny bit of the game. It's like a micro vertical slice. If I just go into this one room in this one level, there's like an art prototype of what the final game should look like, right? That is a thing that already exists in the games industry, that is a widely practiced thing that we can incorporate into our own games. We can make a certain area that is for testing the thing. There is a great Tim Kaine video where he talks about production stages. The other thing he talks about here is test rooms. And I think a very structured approach to game development has this. And and it's about controlled mess, right? One of the tendencies that lots of game developers have is to want to force everything they're doing in the early stages of their game into a thing that seems like a final game, right? They want to have this one room in their game project, and when you run it, you go into the tutorial, and then you're in the first level of the game. That is not the structured way to build a game. You create test rooms. You have like a room for testing combat in, and you put all the weapons in it, and you test stuff out, and then you might have another room that is for testing your lighting approach or something like that, and you do these different sketches of different parts and different systems of your game, and then you start to put them together after you've worked those things out in different contexts. That is the kind of idealized kind of professional way of doing things, and it applies to most creative things. Like imagine if you're writing music, you're a songwriter, you probably, some people will do everything at the same time, but you might have times where you sit down and you just write lyrics. You might have times where you sit down and you just write a drum part, or you just write something on the piano. And you do these little kind of sketches of different parts of the greater whole, and then you put them together. And we have strategies and techniques for doing this that are already very established in the games industry. And I think one of the things that indie developers do at their peril is ignore any advice that ever came from a AAA person, because they go, I couldn't do that because that's a different context. That's someone with 500 staff working under them. It doesn't mean that you need to use different processes, though, or if you need to throw away the kind of things that they've worked out how to do, and that even this kind of finish your first level last kind of doctrine, we get this quote from John Romero where he says finish your first level last. We also know that this was how Mario was designed. So World 1-1 in Mario was the last thing they built, because once you've made the whole game, then you know how people need to be onboarded into it. And we talked about onboarding last month when we talked about tutorialization. I've put him in the sky here, sort of like Mufasa in The Lion King, and I like this sort of implication that John Romero designed Mario that I'm creating with this image. But this is, it's kind of presented as like a wise quote, but it is also just generally how sensible people design their games a lot of the time. So it can make sense, perhaps not if you're making a narrative game, but if you're making a very kind of mechanical systems heavy game to start at the middle or start at the end. Maybe not the end, because the end tends to be a set piece of like some stuff that happens that it doesn't happen in the rest of the game. So maybe make the middle of the game and then make the things earlier on later on, once you know what you need to onboard people into. This is just a kind of very established practice, very established approach to how you create levels for games, which are kind of where your game takes place. Ed Key made a mobile game called Hangline, and has this really good talk on GDC where he kind of goes through it says it's about level creation, but he kind of goes through the entire process of like how the procedural generation, or not, it's not procedural generation, it's like procedural texturing in his game works and stuff like that. And this kind of graph you can see on the left here is what I would expect to see in the planning of any game with lots of levels. So if you look on here, we've got the environment, right? So the environment down here on the left. So this is kind of your art variations. We've got a sand, warm, cool, warm, sand, cool. This is the stuff that stops your game looking visually boring, because you can move through different environments. We've got a general level theme of like, what is the dominant thing happening in this level? We've got the rising of difficulty here. And then we've got different features or gameplay mechanics that exist in the different levels. So Hangline is a game about mountaineering and climbing a mountain. And we've got things like falling rocks, waterfalls, mountain goats here. And he's planned the entire thing out in terms of what is going to be in all of these things. And that gives you a sense of like the entire flow of the game in terms of going from one level to the next. And making sure it's varied and stuff like this. This is a very systematic approach to how you decide what levels to make. And I would really advise watching this if you're making a game that requires you need to make a bunch of different levels and to structure them. This is kind of the approach that we used to take in some of the games I used to work on in a larger studio as well. There's also this slide where he talks about thumbnailing. And this is like doing tiny sketches of something. And the good thing about doing thumbnail sketches is they help you to grasp whether something is too complex or too simple. So all of his levels, he drew these little sketches of them. And the point is that because they're thumbnails, there's multiple of them on the same page. So if you can't, in his case, he's making quite a casual action game. So he wants to be able to see that the level is simple enough that he can fit it into a very small sketch. So this is an interesting kind of glimpse into someone's methodology. And it's also, a solo developer that made their entire game, and they're talking about their kind of level design approach there as well. And I found this. This is like one of my thumbnail sketches from designing surgeries when I was an amateur surgeon 4. Everything we did in that game started out as little doodles like this. It helps you to do the stuff he was talking about in the last example of just make sure it's not too complicated. But it also gives you something that you can discuss with other people much more quickly than doing it in an engine and having to show it to them on a screen. Your mileage may vary. This is something where working with other people in an office might kind of determine how quick different methods are, but I still tend to find drawing something scribbly on paper gets me somewhere a lot quicker than doing it on a computer, because the urge to kind of over polish it is not there so much. And Seamus in the chat just said, what has Romero done in the 30 years since Doom? I mean, he did a bunch of other games, but I'm going to take you through John Romero's rules for making Doom levels. And what I want you to take away from this is not John Romero's rules for creating Doom levels are levels you should use in all level design. It is more this approach of, if you come up with your own rules for how to design your levels and understand what they're trying to achieve, then you will have a good game. You will have a consistent game, okay? So I'm showing you these now, not as an example of good practice for level design, which is how most people talk about these. Most of the time, if you see John Romero's rules for level design presented to you on the internet, they are presented in the kind of, I've jokingly put the stone tablets from the Old Testament here. They're kind of presented that way of like, John Romero made Doom and Doom's really good, so follow his rules. That is not what I'm doing here. Instead, I'm trying to show you that being a game designer and making levels, there is a process there of determining what your own internal rules are for how your levels are made. So these are John's rules. And a couple of these are about art and technical art, and we'll go into why that is in a minute. So, number one, change floor height when changing floor textures. You'll remember old FPSs, very abstract, quite hard to see things if you don't pay attention to this kind of visual stuff. Number two, use special border textures between wall segments and doorways, so we can see the changes and we can see the geometry of the level properly. Be strict about texture alignment. This is more of a housekeeping thing, but here in Doom, he's talking about basically it looks a bit crap if the textures aren't aligned. The kind of exception to this rule would be if you want to slightly highlight a secret door. So a secret door, you would unalign the textures slightly so that players can. There's a tell there. There's a way of knowing that there's a thing there that you can unhide. Use contrast everywhere. Light rooms versus dark rooms, open versus cramped rooms. This is level design advice that still gets repeated today and is still very, very common. And we'll think about why it is in a minute. Number 5, if a player can see outside, they should be able to get there. This feels more like almost like a professional pride thing of like, we don't want to create anything fake in our level. If you can see it, you can go there. Have several secret areas on every level. Make the level flow so the player will revisit areas to give a better understanding of it as a 3D space. And we can think of this as well as you can think of this in terms of like things like Metroidvanias and Souls-likes, where you kind of come back through a level and you come back to somewhere you were before and you see it from a different angle. All of this kind of stuff. Not new to Souls-likes. People have been doing this as early as for as long as they've been making 3D games. Create easily recognizable landmarks in several places for easier navigation. Okay, like I say, I'm not presenting these to you as universal rules of level design. We have 3 potential approaches to this information. When someone tells us these 8 rules, we have 3 ways of approaching this, right? And what I'm doing here is trying to give you a framework for every time you go out there and you seek advice or you seek some sort of guidelines on how to make levels, how to approach that information in future. Because I'm not a level designer. I have done level design, but it's not my specialism. And you are going to go out there and you're going to pick up lots of different information from lots of different talks. And you need to have approach to how you process that information, how you decide what to keep, how you decide what to discard. Because ultimately, if you're working on your own game and you're on your own, you're the leader there and you need to behave like a leader and not a follower. And that's ultimately what being a design lead is about. It's about doing what John Romero is doing here and sort of defining the rules of the project so that the project can be consistent and the project can make sense. So the 3 approaches to this kind of information when we get something like 8 rules of game design, the first approach is follow the rules exactly. And it's probably worth doing that to start off. We were having a discussion in the Discord yesterday, or other people were having a discussion, and I was reading it, about master sketches or master copies, where you pick a painter that you like Francis Bacon or you like Salvador Dali, and you just sit there and you copy it. And you can do this with other media. It's like doing a cover version if you're a musician. It might be like sitting and playing a video game and then recreating the level in something else. Those are master copies. And it's a good way of kind of just learning how and why someone did something the way they did, or learning the basic mechanics of the medium you're working in. So there's definitely a benefit to just following the rules. But at some point, you have to do one of these other 2 things. So the second one is to work out which parts of the rules are universally applicable. So The stuff to do with texture alignment and stuff like that maybe just doesn't apply as much in a modern context, or might not apply in certain types of games. It's certainly not going to apply if you're making a cel-shaded low poly game with no textures, for example. So we think about what here is universally applicable and we can use anywhere. And then the third thing is to do what I just said, to follow John's approach, i.e. to be the person who develops the rules for how level design works in your game, or how whatever it is works in your game, so that going forward, you kind of have something that is consistent, or you have a framework for creating something that is consistent. So these rules that we get from John, if we think about like what design goals do they achieve? Well, some of them relate to making the player feel a sense of achievement and feel skillful. Some of them are to do with legibility and readability, right? Which is why a lot of the art things that he talks about are still game design things rather than kind of art things per se, because they're to do with making sure you can navigate. There's interest versus boredom, giving moments of surprise, delight, and that kind of stuff. And then there's story and world building, which is very thin in Doom, but we can still think about some of his rules in terms of this. This is the point, is that one of the points I'm trying to make is that these rules aren't just arbitrary. They point towards like goals for the player experience, right? And these are kind of categories that I've put them into. So if we go here, you know, we've got a few rules that are to do with making sure that the environment is legible and we can understand it. We've got some rules that are about keeping you excited and stopping you getting bored. We've got some rules that are about world building, like making sure there are landmarks, and all of that kind of stuff. They're not arbitrary rules. They are rules intended to ensure that the game creates a certain type of experience, right? The rules of your game design, of which your level design is part of, should have player experience goals. You're doing a thing to make people feel a certain way, right? You're not just doing it because John Romero says so, or because I say so, or because Steve Lee says so. You're doing it because it achieves a particular player experience goal, right? So this is a common theme when we talk about game design generally, on this channel at least. People sometimes want me to kind of give them universal rules of thumb for game design and say, always do this or never do this. And sometimes that's down to educational background. Some people never get to go into an educational environment where they're told to have their own opinions about stuff. Some people's entire experience of being educated is being told things, being told what to think, being told the rules of something and expected to follow them. But that is not how art and design work. And it's not even how like something like computer science or engineering works. You have to have an approach. You have to have your own opinion about things. You have to have, be the person who makes the rules for your project rather than following other rules. It can be very helpful to constrain yourself with rules, but you sort of still need to understand why you're putting them in place. So there are no universal rules to game design. There are universally understood truths of human psychology, how humans think and how they perceive things. And when we talk about game design or level design and we talk about good practice, we're usually talking about those things. It's not usually like you should always put a tree next to a door. I don't know why that would be a rule anyway, but they are not level design rules per se. They are insights into how humans behave and how they perceive things that we can then apply in our level design, in our game design. Raspoopin in the chat, sorry, I'm only sort of occasionally dipping into the chat, says, does this catch out why GDDs are kind of crap? I mean, I've done one video on GDDs on this entire channel, and I talked about a minimalistic approach where you use the GDD to help yourself focus a little bit on every area of your game so that you don't miss out any area that might be your blind spot, which is what we often do. We go, we sort of work on a game for ages, and then you realize there's a big missing thing, like something just fundamentally doesn't make sense, or there's something about the game that's really unappealing, and we realize we've got a personal blind spot. Like, I'm not very good at story, or I'm not very good at game feel, or something like that. And I think for an indie developer, small-time indie developer, the purpose of a game design document is really just to make you sure that you are thinking of everything. Not in loads of depth, not writing a big Bible of it, but just bullet points of like, how are we going to achieve this area of the game? How are we going to deal with this issue? That kind of thing. And I think actually a game design document can be a very good place for doing this kind of stuff for your game, right? For saying, this is the approach we're going to take. When we make levels, here are some rules, and we'll follow them. And if they don't work out, we'll change them. Game design documents should be flexible like that generally. Yeah. So these, I put these icons again because these are user experience things that are reasonably universal, right? Players want to feel like skillful achievers. Players want to explore a world and its mysteries. Players want to understand what they're doing and looking at. That's more of a kind of cognitive usability thing. And players want to experience variety and surprises. Now, these will exist in different balances depending on the type of game you're making, who plays that type of game, but these are universal things that people want to get out of a game, and the decisions you make about your level design should feed into these things. This is where it starts to get really complex as well, is that as a solo developer, you are going to be dealing with the fact that level design is all of these things, or that a level is all of these things, right? So a level in your game is a place, right? People perceive it as a place, like a simulation of a place in a world. It's also an experience. So, people kind of act like, as soon as you say experience in game design, a lot of more technical people switch off. But what I mean by this is it is meant to give you emotions in a sequence, right? Which stem from things like, there is a piece of combat, then there is a big silent area between encounters, and then there is another encounter, and then there is a puzzle. Like, all of this kind of structuring of encounters and activities for the player to do is thinking of the level as an experience, and you have to balance these things. And then the last point is that, like all game design, is that what you are creating is a language. So if the thing is inconsistent with itself, or if it doesn't follow enough conventions of what people are used to from game design or from level design, then it will confuse people, right? And the intention of this slide is really to empathize with you. If you're working on your own or in a very small team, is that this is the challenges that is in front of you when you sit down to do any sort of level design. And one of the reasons why we tend to err on the side of making sort of relatively abstract sci-fi and like dungeon-based fantasy and stuff is that it means you don't have to do this, right? We don't have to think about how this place functions as a representation of a real world. We can just have random rooms and stuff. We don't have to think about where the toilet is in the dungeon. We don't have to think about where the HR department works in the spaceship and stuff like that. That's one of the reasons why certain genres are just more practical for a game developer, because we can kind of rule this out. But even then, you have to think of your level as a kind of series of experiences that are structured in a particular way, and as a language that players need to understand, because you're usually going to be expecting players to do the same thing over and over again. And if you break the pattern in ways that is kind of frustrating or confusing, then you're going to be upsetting people. And frustration isn't always bad. I was watching a talk the other day, can't remember the guy's name, but he was talking about frustration as being like a currency with game designers. So you give people a certain amount of frustration, and then they sort of pay it in and feel relief, and then you give it back out again, and then they pay it in and feel relief. And you sort of need that to a degree with a game. But the frustration should come from the challenge of the encounters and the puzzles, and challenge can include things like getting lost. one of the classic things in level design is a level should have a goal, right? Players should know what they're trying to do when they go into a level. They're trying to get to that landmark, or they're trying to flee the enemies. That's a classic Half-Life one. They're trying to flee the enemies, and the goal should be obvious, but you sometimes hide the goal, right? So there's a landmark, and as I'm working my way towards the landmark, we hide it, and you lose the landmark for a little bit, and then you find it again, and you feel relief, and then you lose the landmark again, and then you find it again, and you feel relief. That's the kind of thing that you have to think about when you're thinking about your level as an experience, rather than just like a place with some art in it, you know? Okay, so the three questions that correspond to these, we'll come back to this at the end, because I think it's like the big takeaway that you'll get in this talk that you wouldn't get from watching random, like not random, but like how to design a level type stuff, is that these are the three things that most of the time your level needs to do. It needs to tell a story or create a sense of mystery. And you don't have to be, you know, there's this muddy middle between story and theme in games. So if you're making a roguelike, for example, and your game doesn't have a story, the environment should still have a kind of mood or theme to it. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. Now, it may be that you make a Gone Home walking simulator type thing, and your game is entirely about telling a story or creating a mystery through the environment. But all games do this to some degree, even if it is just that we're in the lava room, now we're in the ice room, that kind of thing. It needs to provide some sort of variety of experience or challenge, right? So if we just focus on challenge and we just you go into this room and you kill some guys, you go into the next room and you kill some more guys, and we don't provide the kind of psychological variety of being in a narrow dark room and then being in a big light room, people are going to get bored. And those extreme variations that we talked about earlier of going from light to dark, going from small to large, all of those things are one of the cheapest ways to keep people interested and to stop them getting bored. And that doesn't require loads of environmental art. And it happens at the grey box stage of just like, how big are these rooms relative to each other? And then, yeah, the third point is the games as language thing. What needs to be consistent in your game to avoid confusion? And those of you who are a bit older and have been playing games for a long time may have noticed this as it happened. If you've had a game series that's been around since the 90s and you've played it all the way through, you will probably find the visual communication in that game gets worse. So, for example, in early Tomb Raider, it's incredibly easy to see when there's a block you can push, when there's a ledge you can climb, because the game is so abstract and blocky that it just communicates itself very, very well. As soon as you start going into very realistic graphics, this is one of the reasons why AAA developers started doing yellow painting everywhere and putting yellow paint in the environment and that kind of stuff. It's not because, like, audiences have got dumber or developers are patronizing audiences more. It's because the increase in visual fidelity and the more kind of visual realistic approach makes it harder for people to read the environment. So you have to create consistency through some other way, right? So it's yellow paint. In the Silent Hill 2 remake, it was like putting toilet paper on cracks in the walls and putting white cloth over things you could climb over. I know people don't like that approach, but it is the kind of price that we pay for visual realism. We didn't used to need it, right? We didn't used to need it because more abstract games that use simpler geometry were just easier to read and understand as a language, which is kind of what I'm talking about here. If you have like a way of representing a door, and like the classic one is old games, you can see which doors you can go through and which ones you can't. If you have a kind of more realistic looking game and you have doors you can go through and doors you can't, you need a way of communicating that. So in Dishonored, it is that there has been a plague and the doors are like welded shut because of the plague, right? So there we're tying in the visual language of our level design to the world building of the history of the plague. They do a similar thing in Elden Ring when you go to the capital and there's like this weird golden welding around the doors that sort of explains why you can't go inside them. I love letting people climb up and jump on anything as long as the physics allow it, yeah. But It needs to be the right sort of game, right? And as soon as you go towards having very, very visually realistic characters, and you have to animate them well on every surface and stuff like that, then it falls down. And that's one of the reasons why indies shouldn't aim to make visually realistic games, because you just create a rod for your own back in terms of this stuff. So I will go through a few more kind of tips that I've gleaned from other places, but you should go and read the tips because I'm just picking out a few examples. So your goal as a level designer isn't to create spaces, right? That is, if you go and you find like I'm going to pick on you again, Drax. I'm sorry. You've got a lot of people like Dark Dax here who are very competent at using a game engine, and they will put out content about level design, and it will just be about how to put things in an environment in a game engine and the kind of technical art and the environmental art side of things. Remember that as a level designer, your goal is not just to put stuff in an environment and make it look beautiful. It's to understand how players use space, to understand how players understand space. When a player is put into a virtual environment, what are the things they usually do based on human psychology, based on how they read the environment, all of those things. So this leads us to insights like this, where this is Ali Youssef's blog. Again, link in the description. Players flow like water, but they move like a car. This is coming back to that idea of like the only universal truths of game design are to do with human psychology and behavior. So when it comes to flow, this idea that players flow like water, it means they will try and go into every area of a level. They will try and go into every area of a level, but they don't turn 90-degree angles as they do that. They move like a car. They sort of twist and turn like that, right? Yes, yeah. So we have this behavior. The flowing like water is like it's almost like a version of loss aversion, right? We want to check out every nook and cranny. We don't want to miss out on an opportunity to find a particular treasure or a secret or something like that. And that creates this behavior of how we move around the space, right? So it's not just like a cognitive thing of how we move around space. It's a thing of how we move around space that is driven by other behaviors in the game. If we had a game that had no collectibles, nothing to find, we might not move in this water-like, flow-like way, but we try and find every vantage point in the level and every corner of the game because we think there might be something there. If the game teaches people that there's never something there, they will stop behaving like this, right? And then this moving like a car thing, I think most of us who've played a game have experienced this. It's just an efficiency thing that we sort of, if we have to go a particular way, we're going to kind of cut across the middle. And that's just a kind of general way that humans behave. Again, you probably will have seen the UX meme where it's got like two paths that have been beautifully fashioned and then people want to walk across the middle. So there's just like a mud track in the middle where everyone's walked, right? It's to do with just efficiency of movement more than anything, right? This blog by Ali Youssef has lots of these little tips in it, and I'll come back to one more in a minute, but we're not going to exhaustively go through the list. It's kind of just going back to my point of level design is understanding how people think and how they behave based on how they think. You've also got stuff like this. There's an architectural approach to level design. I'm not going to go through this list because I've printed it very small, but I will be making slides of this. If you're on the Patreon, then there will be like an ad-free version of this VOD go up when I finished recording it, and I'll add the slides there and you can look through this. But it kind of goes without saying that architecture is part of level design, and that if you are making representations of buildings, that you will learn some degree of architecture as you do that. But this is a book that is much more about taking the approach that architects take when they build spaces and applying it to game design. So thinking about how a space is used, how it's supposed to make you feel, the different directions that people might move through it, all of that kind of stuff. There's some interesting stuff in there. Raspupin had a good question that has just reminded me of something that happened in a previous job that I think is probably relevant here. So Raspupin said, wondered about using real life references, real life places and layouts. I guess it depends. But do real life places consider flow in some way? I mean, yes, a good architect will consider flow. That's why, that's why a foyer is the way it is. That's why you have a big foyer. So as people are going from one area of a building to another building, they don't go into like a cramped hallway and like bump into each other. There's a big open space and people can avoid each other, right? That's why airports and train stations are designed that way. But one of the dangers you need to watch out for when you use real life places, this is one of the most common rookie level design issues I've seen, and I've seen it at work before, where someone desperately wants something to look like a real place. And one of the issues that often creates is just too much symmetry, because we create symmetrical buildings in real life because symmetry is kind of beautiful and stuff. So we create these real life symmetrical buildings, and then people try and recreate them in games. And the problem is that symmetry makes things harder to remember and navigate. So you're gonna see all of these different corners of a symmetrical room and they will look similar to each other. So that's one of the reasons why something like a post-apocalyptic setting works very well, because you can have modern buildings which were initially symmetrical, but you can like differentiate them by having, this side of the building is all caved in and fallen through, and this side of the building has plants all growing over it. So even though the real building was symmetrical, you can break the symmetry through other means. So avoid making overly symmetrical buildings, and you will notice that like brutalist architecture often has you kind of look at it and it all looks the same. If you've played Control, the game Control, which is all brutalist architecture, the layouts are very strange and asymmetrical and stuff like that. And that is partly because when we're in a real space, we don't have this problem with navigating in a symmetrical building. But when you put people in a game, they're not really there, are they? They're in a sort of simulation, and our navigational ability relies in a game relies on our understanding of like being able to differentiate that corner from that corner from that corner. If your game world is too symmetrical, you're gonna make people confused. So that's the thing to watch out for. Definitely use reference. Definitely look at real buildings. But when a building that you're using as reference, whether it's an interior or outside, is too symmetrical, think of how you can break the symmetry, because symmetry will make people get lost. Here are more examples from the Ali Youssef block. And again, this is like, I'm not showing you this to show you how to do stairs. I'm showing it to you to show you how much thought goes into stairs when you're designing levels. So like here we've got some examples of how a level designer approaches stairs. So in this example, you go up there and you go up there, and you're always sort of going into the new section blind. So as you run down the stairs, you enter the new room and you see everything. Whereas what's happening here is, like in this last room, when I come into it, I don't go down the stairs until I've used this vantage point, right? So if we look at the difference between here and here, this is you just run blind into the room as you come down the stairs. This is you come into the room and then you have the option to go down the stairs or to use the vantage point to look around, right? This is such a subtle difference in terms of like the physicality of the level, but it's a world of difference in terms of the player experience, because you're creating decision points. Like in this second room, instead of just going straight down the stairs into the room, we come in here and we have an option of do we go down the stairs or do we go down the further away stairs, and we have a vantage point, right? So this is just an example of like how many points of consideration there are in something as simple as how do I use stairs in my game, right? How do we make it so that you can see stairs when you're approaching them? Well, it can be hard to see them from a distance, so we want to telegraph them up front. We want to have them sticking out a little bit, like these ladders or these stairs here. Yep. How do we see them when we turn a corner? Well, we might want the stairs to sort of announce themselves and stick out or stick in a little bit so that they don't just disappear. And then just generally that spiral stairs are kind of horrible. I don't think I've ever played a game where going up or down spiral stairs felt good. But the point is that if there's any common object in your game, whether it's stairs, barrels, doors, or something like that, this is the amount of thinking that you should do about that element, right? You're kind of creating your own set of internal rules of how you use an element. Like if you've got vines that you swing on in your level, where do they appear? How do you use them? Where do they not appear? All of that kind of stuff. Because if you think of your game as a language that players need to learn in order to operate it, and you break that language too much, you break the rules of that language, or you just don't have any rules and you don't follow them, then people aren't going to be able to play your game and they're not going to have a good time. I love a good vent. Deus Ex Human Revolution. Big fan of my personal challenge in Human Revolution was trying to KO in the police station level, trying to KO every single person in the building and put them all inside the vents. And I did it, and I had like 30 futuristic police officers all just sort of laying on top of each other in the vents. It was probably the happiest day of my life. But remember, whenever you see... So coming back to the general point of this talk, whenever you see this kind of stuff, like a tip or a set of rules for something in level design, it's really helpful. Absorb it, use it, but remember that on your game, you are probably the lead. You are probably the lead programmer and the lead level designer and all this thing. And that means that your job is to think like the person who made this guide. Your job is to think like John Romero when he was making his list of 8 rules for level design. Your job is to come up with the rules of your game so that your game can be consistent and easy for people to understand in the right places. Okay. I'm going to take a quick break from the slides now just to go back through the chat and see if there's any kind of questions we've missed. Please feel free to throw any questions in. Remember, I am not actually a level designer. I've worked on... 4 or 5 commercial projects where level design was part of what I did, but I am by no means a specialist. FX Node said, have you published your own indie game? It depends what you mean, doesn't it? Because there is a development... But the answer is no. I would say there is a development culture on here that basically says that you should try and sell every project you finish, which I think is a terrible idea. I'm an advocate for quality, and I'm an advocate for there being a hard distinction between doing something as a learning project and doing something for a public audience to buy. And for that reason, I have various games I've made up on my itch profiles and stuff like that. Other people might have put them up for $2 or something and said, I've published an indie game. I don't consider those to be indie games. I think indie is a publishing term to do with like how you're funded, how you publish a game. I don't think everyone making a hobby project and just sticking it on itch is really making indie games, because you're not really independent. You're just an unemployed hobbyist, right? Which is like, it's a different thing. So I haven't published my own indie game. Maybe one day I will. But the whole point of this channel is I've been working as a commercial game designer for like most of my professional career, and I'm giving advice to people based on that. So rather than a lot of YouTube channels where you've got a hobbyist who's maybe released a couple of games and started a business as an indie game dev giving advice to people, here it is, I've worked on, at least a dozen commercially released games now, in all sorts of weird and wonderful different kind of circumstances. And when I was a couple of years when I was teaching, I taught, I don't know how many it would have been. It would have been about like 300 undergraduate game design students in that time, and some at master's level. So if the question is, have you published your own indie game, because the assumption is I'm not qualified to talk about this stuff unless I publish my own indie game, then go away. But hopefully that gives you a sense of why I'm qualified to talk about this kind of stuff. Someone always comes in with that type of question. There is a sort of philosophy on YouTube that the only way that someone could know game design is if they've made Choo Choo Charles or something like that. And it's kind of dumb, really. Rasputin, that's a good question. Yeah. Durant, I don't know about whether we'll do a combat design talk. Because one of the things I'm trying to avoid here is just doing too many talks about stuff that I'm not an expert in. So what tends to happen if I'm not an expert in it is I gather stuff from everywhere else. But I play quite a lot of games on the streams that have combat in them, and I think so much of it again is not going to be having universal rules, but sort of it's situational, isn't it? You prototype the thing, you play it, you see what's wrong with it, you prototype it again. I would say if you want a reasonably small book to read that covers things like combat design and game feel for action games, then Swink's book Game Feel is incredibly good, and I'll probably be covering it on the Game Developers Library podcast in the next couple of months. Raspupin said, I'd love to hear your opinion on hardcore games like Tarkov that break the conventions of gaming language and hide behind the veil of it's hardcore, bro. Yeah, I mean, I think games like Tarkov are in a sort of simulationist space, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad game design. It's just it's game design coming from a particular angle. And the thing is that people that make and play simulationist games where everything is trying to be ultra realistic and inaccessible, they're just a different type of gamer and everything. So I would never say that is like, I get what you're saying. It's sort of hiding behind the veil of, it's hardcore or whatever. Again, there are no universal rules. It's all about context. So what you don't do is make a very accessible game and then justify some things by being like, well, that's what would realistically happen. Because what would realistically happen is in most cases not fun to most people. The type of people that play very hardcore simulationist games, whether they're actual simulators like Train Simulator or something like that, or things like America's Army or something like that, they want a particular thing out of a game, which is to be immersed in a particular type of way. And most gamers do not find that immersive. Most gamers do not find like really tedious high-level simulation of or low-level simulation of everything to be enjoyable. It's why people hate weapon degradation and hunger mechanics and stuff like that. I quite like those things sometimes, but it's all about context and what is the game going for, and is it appropriate in the context, Chris Chung, could you offer a definition for level designer to help me anchor what I'm listening to? Really the stuff I talked about at the beginning, where a level design is, level design is not environmental art. It is about the functionality and gameplay of the game in context, right? Because you can design the rules of the game in an empty room, and you can say, here's how the combat works, here's how you interact with these objects. And level design is when you take that gameplay and you put it in a location, and the location in some way changes or modifies how it feels to play those game rules, right? It's all of that up until the point where you add the environmental art, and then it stops being level design, it starts being environmental art. Let me give you an example I've used before. Golf is a game that exists as a set of rules. You have golf clubs, you hit a ball, you try and get in a hole. The concept of golf exists, right? But golf cannot really exist and be played without a golf course, right? So the level design is creating the golf course. Now, if I decide that I'm going to make crazy golf and I'm going to put lots of gimmicks on my golf course, so I'm going to have a dinosaur and a windmill and all of that kind of stuff, that's more like environmental art. That's beautifying the course so it's interesting, tells a story, and it can have some functional properties as well. It can include things like lighting or adding landmarks that are also navigational tools, but that is not really the core of the level design. The core of the level design is like, when I stand here and look over there, what can I see? When I move here, what happens? All of that kind of stuff. So there is not a very easy, pithy way of defining that, sorry, but that is the definition. And Sean is here, and Sean has probably done way more level design than I have, as far as I can tell. Do you do the level design on your team, Sean? Let's see what else some people have. Timotheus, I mean, Timotheus said, how about games that don't have levels like pinball or pachinko? I mean, that's an interesting one. And if you think of the video games that do well in those spaces, is they do have multiple levels or tables, right? So if you play pinball, if you're a fan of pinball, when I was younger, there were no pinball tables here, and then I went abroad in my early 20s, and everywhere had a pinball table, and I was like, oh my! I became a pinball addict for a weekend. And when you play pinball, or when you play escape rooms, for example, you become a player of that thing generally, just like the golf example, and you go around from thing to thing. So you might not have levels of a pinball table within the same pinball, but once you are playing it and you try out different pinball tables, and then that's like playing different levels. And if you think of pinball video games that have done well, they do have multiple tables within them. And I think the pachinko example would be something like Peglin, where you've got lots of different layouts of the same thing. Peggle or Peglin both have that. Alexi Breska said, how about balancing room sizes to not make them feel too gamey? Would you base it on established metrics like height and run speeds? Yeah, so metrics is like a term that is used to basically define certain things before you build levels. So something like how high can the player jump? How fast can they move? I would generally veer on the side of gamey in most cases, particularly in the indie space. I can't think of many cases where someone is making a game on their own or in a very small team where they should be trying to make a realistic environment. The only exception to that would be if you're making a game like Gone Home or Firewatch or something like that, where the game is predominantly a narrative game that is about being immersed in a world. Most of the time, players don't care about that. If you give them slightly outdoor sizes or room sizes for gameplay considerations, if they're there to play a game, if they're there to jump around and shoot a gun or solve a puzzle, they're going to forgive you that. So I think in most cases, particularly in the indie space, not in AAA, but particularly in the indie space, players are very tolerant of things feeling gamey. So I think there's a sliding scale there of, too realistic and too gamey. Most players are quite tolerant of things being too gamey. And I think one of the things that's really good about the boomer shooter revival, and I played Blood Thief a couple of months ago, and I was talking about this then, is the environment in that case is so easy to read precisely because it is so gamey. It is so flat. The geometry is so clear. There's very clear, like, oh, this wall is of different texture from this floor. And the developer's still gone to efforts to say, oh, this bit's in a town, this bit's in a lava dungeon, and all of that kind of stuff. But that theming of the areas is kind of paper thin. It is all about the level geometry and making the level space memorable and easy to navigate and stuff like that. And I would generally say in the indie space, that's what people want. People want an emphasis on the playability over the realism. And part of the reason for that is if they care about the realism, if they care about, if they want The Last of Us, they're going to play The Last of Us. They're not going to play like a clunky indie version of The Last of Us if that is the type of experience they want, So, Chris, good question. Chris said, where's the scene between what I'm talking about and Steve Lee's practice where it's about vista storytelling and set pieces? I recommended Steve's channel at the start of this video, and I said, if you want to know how to make a level, you should watch Steve's channel. I think it's probably the best resource on YouTube for this stuff. Steve is amazing. He explains things in a very good way, and it's very like hands-on how to make a level. The point of this talk has been how indie developers should approach the practice of level design within their games, right? And your indie game, it might be a pinball game, it might be a match 3, it might be something that doesn't have conventional levels that are like spaces that you move around in. So I've tried to approach it from that perspective because this channel is, a lot of the audience of this channel are solo developers working on one thing. And what they don't need necessarily is like, here is how to make a level for a AAA game, which is what a lot of other stuff is, you know? Yeah, so this talk is much more, okay, you're making a game. It's got these things in it called levels, probably. What are they? And then once you've got that, then the stuff that Steve teaches is going to be much more helpful. You know, if you've already started building three-dimensional environments for your game and you want tips on that, then Steve's channel is going to be way, way better for that. But I think, yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of people struggle with in the indie space, or in this kind of gap, I will call it semi-professional, right? Like people that are hobbyists and they're trying to release a game, they're trying to go from being a hobbyist developer into a full-time developer, all of that kind of space, is that you sort of need to acknowledge that you're the boss, and it's you need to make decisions about this thing. You need to make the rules of your game and be consistent and follow them. And most of what there is to learn about how to design a level or game design theory is just understanding people. It's understanding people, understanding our cognitive biases, our perceptual biases, what we find beautiful, what we find scary, all of those kinds of things. And if you have a good grasp of that, then when you come to make your own game, you can come up with this. You know, I was talking about earlier about how John Romero's level design rules relate to user experience goals or player experience goals. We have these 3 rules because these will help players feel a sense of achievement, right? If we put 3 secrets in every level, we will encourage a particular type of behavior. And if we don't have that as a rule, then we're going to frustrate people because they'll get used to there being a certain amount of secrets. And then we have a level with no secrets and people will be frustrated by it, right? So it's that kind of thinking of how you approach this stuff is what I'm trying to encourage here. Hi, Ilya. I occasionally look at horror games. I have a submission portal on my website. It's also, there's a link to it on the homepage of the channel where you can submit games. The reason there haven't been any horror games for a while is I group together similar games and then do them in the same stream. So when I have multiple horror games, I will put them together. I will generally say, though, that a horror game for me really does have to have some sort of gameplay for it to be interesting. And this problem I've seen other games struggle with is no gameplay at all, or the gameplay and the horror are too closely packed together. So like trying to get me to read things or solve a puzzle while there's jump scares happening, that kind of lack of attention to like what human capabilities are, right? Because I talked about this. I've got a video about polyvagal theory and horror games and puzzles, and why traditional horror games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, feels very funny to call them traditional, but they have puzzles in, but they don't make you solve puzzles while you're fighting, right? Because when you go into fight or flight mode, you're actually in a totally different mode in terms of your cognition and your nervous system, and you can't think in a deductive way. So I have some high standards for horror games, so I cover them occasionally, but the ones that are just sort of ghost trains with jump scares I don't find very interesting, and I find the ones that try to do horror and gameplay often struggle with these kind of problems. Seamus said, I buy a lot of small indie games. There's a lot of crap. They need to listen to these design principles. It would make a huge difference. Yeah, I mean, I think the reason there's a lot of crap is just that people, when they first start making games, they just go straight for like the illusion of a place and they don't think about anything else. They just go, oh, we're in the forest now. What does a forest look like? And they make a forest, and they're not thinking about the flow of the player through the level and the kind of more psychological stuff. And you can practice that stuff. You can practice that stuff in RPG Maker, you know. There are also, the other thing is there are level design jams. I think Steve runs one of these as well, where you just make a level for another game, right? Very good way to practice making levels. And then you don't get in this chicken and egg situation that we end up in as indie developers, where it's like, you know, the classic advice that you get if you sort of go to a AAA level designer and they tell you what they do. It's like, we start with the metrics, we start with the mechanics, we understand what the player character can do, and it's like, well, what if I'm making the game and I haven't worked those things out yet? And you know, the Lost Relic talk I link to in the description is a good example of why you should try and structure your game so that you're not doing too much level design until you've worked out those things. But there's always going to be a little bit of push and pull between those elements in a solo project where things are messy and you don't have a producer or anything like that. People release things that should be practice projects. Yep. We need a tier below itch that is just like called here's my game.io, and it's not. It's got no selling the game functionality on it at all, but I don't see how that would make any profit for the owners of the website. Sub-Zero Black said, any tips for linear games like Bioshock, how to make different areas distinct or engaging? I think having a structured approach like the spreadsheet I showed you from the mountain climbing game is a good way of doing it. So you step through and you're like, what am I doing? What's the player doing in each area? What's the visual theme of each area? At what points is there like a standout landmark? That kind of thing. And if you do all of that before, it's almost like there's stages, right? And people often talk about the grey box being the first stage. And there's like a stage before that where you just have like a narrative of what happens in the level. It's like, oh, we're in the office. And then we find this, and then this happens, and then we go downstairs, and then we're in the cafeteria, and things start to get darker. Like having a little paragraph narrative, or breaking it down into a spreadsheet of like, it's kind of like when you're planning story beats, if you're writing a book or a script or something, having that worked out first, so that then when you go to Greybox, you sort of know what the areas are for before you put them together, because otherwise you just put in a bunch of squares in a thing, you know? Here are a couple of things I asked on the Discord for people's favorite things in level design. So there'll probably be some things that resonate with you here. Some of them are also my favorite things. Cheese and K, I truncated your names if you're in the chat now, because I didn't know if I should share them or not. But Cheese said, I was asking for favorite level design tropes. I was over there. Now I'm way up here, and I can see where I was. Classic Dark Souls thing. Happens in the Undead Burg. One of my, I a lot of my own projects are in 2D. This is the type of thing that makes me go, I'd like to make a 3D game one day, because you can do this. You can't do it so much in 2D games. You can do it to a degree of like, oh, I'm now up on that cliff. If you think of like a Harvest Moon type game, you can occasionally have moments where you get somewhere that you could see for ages and you couldn't access it, and now you're there, but it's just not quite the same as like seeing the place you were from another angle. And I think this is one of like the strongest things that you can do with 3D games. The Poison World, Lava World, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with just having a themed world in your game. I think depending on what type of game it is, you need to sort of be able to justify why those areas have those themes, but it's a good place to start from. Another FromSoft, I have no idea where I'm going. Then you kick down the ladder back to the bonfire and the full level loop shortcut clicks in and connects a mental model of the dungeon layout. Yeah, that's really satisfying. It makes you feel relief because you're lost, and then you know where you are again, and that's an interesting, like, I think a lot of stuff to do with engagement, and when we think about like game psychology, is to do with giving people these changes in state of like I'm lost and now I'm not, or I'm frustrated and now I'm relieved. And like level design is one of your tools to be able to do this. And I talked earlier about the example where I watched another talk. I haven't linked it because I forgot to include it here, but the level designer kind of creates a goal for the level that is like a lighthouse you need to get to, and then shows you around the level of like hiding the lighthouse in various ways. As you go into different areas, you lose it and you find it again. This kind of thing of like knowing what you're doing, knowing that the level has a goal from the start. You're trying to get to that place, you're trying to get away from this place, but then just hiding and showing and hiding and showing the game, so hiding and showing the goal, so that you get this kind of flip-flop feeling of knowing what you're doing, not knowing what you're doing. It's kind of like, I don't know, like the ability to get lost in games, I think can be quite powerful. And I think one of the times, we talked about earlier about yellow paint in AAA games and how yellow paint needed to be added because realism makes games more visually confusing than having like abstract blocky games. So it was like the price you pay for having a more realistic game. And I feel a similar way about having GPS in games and games that lead you everywhere and show you how to go. I used to quite enjoy getting lost in games. I think it's one of the pleasures is getting lost and then found again. If you've ever been like to another country or another town and you've stayed there a few days, and the first night you like go out and you get lost, and it feels like you've walked hours and hours away from your hotel or wherever you're staying, and then the next day you take the same walk and you realize it was only 10 minutes away. But there's something happening with your like perception of this place because it's new and scary that just totally warps it. And then the next day you feel a slight mastery over the space and you're like, oh, this was scary yesterday, but now I've been at it from all of these different directions at different times of day, and I understand it, and I have this kind of psychological mastery of this place that I'm in. That's a really satisfying transition to go through, to experience, and it's one that we experience in the real world where we go to new places and stay there for a little while. But it's one that we can experience through video games, and this is part of the reason why, John Romero was talking about the horseshoe-shaped level design where you go round and wasn't the kind of looping level design where you go back through the same space from a different angle and all of that kind of stuff. We enjoy mastering the geography of a place and kind of coming to know it in from all these different angles, and you can use that to your benefit as an indie developer as well, because you might make a game that is all set in one place that doesn't have distinct levels, but where things like loop back through each other in satisfying ways. I always used to love in Harvest Moon, the very first one on the SNES. I played it like in the early 2000s on an emulator, but that was a game where the actual total space of the game was quite small. There weren't loads and loads of rooms or places you could go, but there were lots of places where you could open up a shortcut that took you from one place to another and stuff like that. And I think Stardew Valley does that a little bit, although Stardew Valley is a bit more expansive. I think Graveyard Keeper does it probably better than Stardew Valley to a degree. I'm imagining Scope Sheep walking back from the pub, but I can only imagine you as an actual sheep, which is making it funnier. CodeRad said, how do you approach level design for games like, say, The Spire, where there is no real level exploration? Yeah, I mean, then you're not talking about space at all. You're talking about scheduling of content. And I think you would still take this approach. Sorry for all my clicking, but I don't really know how to jump slides on Canva. You'd still take this approach where you're sort of thinking about the schedule of content, right? So this is like a content plan or a content schedule based on level design in a game with physical spatial levels that you move around in. But it's going like, what's the difficulty? What's the theme? What things are included in this, right? So if I was making Slay the Spire, I might say, okay, in the first section of the game, or in the first third, I guess, of the first climb, I have I have enemies with different types of abilities, and I gradually teach the player the mechanics by showing them enemies with different types of abilities in a certain order, right? So you create this type of plan, and that's kind of the nearest thing to doing a level design plan for a game that doesn't have levels. Even for like a procedurally generated game, you would probably do the same sort of thing, yeah. Okay, I've got a little summary of some of the stuff at the end of this talk that I wanted to jump back to, just because I think it was like the most important part. The level design is hard. That's it. That's it. I really, there is a subgenre of game development content that I absolutely hate, which is just like people saying game dev is hard and then nothing else. And then it's like, it's a sort of like empathy, like it's just pure empathy tourism or something, where people are doing something it's hard and they don't really want advice on it. They just want someone else to go, yeah, it's hard, isn't it? It's like, because a lot of us are doing this in isolation. We're not surrounded by other people making games. We just want someone else that understands how hard it is. But I really hate it when when there's game dev content that just ends there. It's hard. That's it. That's it. I'm not gonna give you any advice. I'm just gonna tell you it's hard. Bye. Yeah, it's the how to draw an owl. How to draw an owl. Draw 2 circles. Draw the rest of an owl. Yeah, it's like, what's the value of this? Like, surely you can empathize with people and say things are hard, and then also say something of value as well. Level design is hard because levels are all of these things, right? And you're having to juggle these different things. Your level is a place, and you can mitigate that. And we do mitigate it by making games set in abstract dungeons, by making games set in abstract space stations. Those are some of the reasons why fantasy and sci-fi genres are so predominant, is that they create these kind of slightly abstract ways of viewing the game world, where we don't care that there's not a break room and a toilet in the dungeon and stuff like that, even though someone worked there at some point. All of those kind of things, right? We can avoid a simulationist approach to our world building and create games in spaces that are more gamey and less worldy. But we're still, this first thing, a game is a place or a world, we're still factoring that into our level design most of the time, even if it's just trying to create a distinction between, I don't know, the first bit, the caves bit of Binding of Isaac and the hell bit of Binding of Isaac. There's still some thought going into this kind of stuff. There is the game as an experience and the level as an experience, and this is why I said, before you even go to Greybox, write down a little, like, 2-sentence story of what is happening in each level, right? Because the overall, like, particularly if you're trying to make a game with a story where combat is part of a story, if you're getting attacked by like 100 dudes in every level, that's a particular type of game, and it doesn't really tell a story. If you want the game to tell a story, then what are the different types of being attacked? Well, there's being attacked while you're trying to escape somewhere. There's like stealth stuff, all of that kind of stuff. How do you kind of structure these things so that there's variation? And it's not just like the same thing happening over and over again. So you're keeping that in mind when you're designing levels, when you're putting encounters into levels, when you're staggering counters and other things that you can do, like social NPCs and stuff like that. Language, what in your game needs to be consistent for people to understand it? What are you doing in levels that's like a repeated motif or something that needs to be kind of presented the same way each time, otherwise people will get confused? And also, how does that language of your game tie into other games? Because so often I see games where it's like a very well-trodden genre, and there are just basic UX things in the game where it's like, have you played the games that you are copying here? And just so often, game developers get so lost in using their game engine that they forget that they probably need to actually go and play the game that they're basing their game on, or at least, I don't know, look up the wiki and read how the controls worked or something like that, because people learn how to do things in one game and then they carry it over to the next game. And if you break too many rules just for the sake of it, or because you were kind of being lazy and not doing research, then that's a bad look, and people will be frustrated, and they'll be right to be. Your levels are a language. What's consistently the same in all of your levels? What patterns do players need to learn in order to progress through the game? And how do you stagger or structure this learning? So this was like the spreadsheet I showed you from the mountain climbing game. Once you know all of the components of your game, and then you need to think about how are they going to be staggered across levels? How am I introducing these things, in what order? And like, how frequently do we repeat certain things, and all of that kind of stuff. Your levels are an experience. This is where stuff like contrasts come in. This is where stuff like dark room, light room, narrow room, big room, all of these kind of contrasts come in, so that your experience is varied, so that it feels like a roller coaster of some sorts. And you can do all of that through environment if you're making an environmentally led game. Even before you put anything to do in that environment, you can kind of create a space that shrinks and contracts and all of that kind of stuff. Also thinking about how your levels provide opportunities to use mechanics in novel ways. Now, in an ideal world, you're going to know what all your mechanics are before you build your levels, but we just often can't work that way. So if you find you're in a position where you're developing the mechanics and the levels as you go along, that is not ideal. But I would suggest what you should do in that scenario is the first few things you make, understand that they're a bit of a mess. They're going to be a bit of a mess. So put them towards the middle or the end of the game, and then fill out the stuff before that with stuff that teaches you the mechanics, so that when you get to those levels that are messy or poorly constructed, obviously you should go back and make them better. I'm always going to encourage you to revisit things, make them better, or throw them away if they're terrible. But if you feel like you need to include those first things you made in the game, do not put them at the beginning. And I think Ibby in the chat said, you don't write a novel start to finish linearly. It's the same thing. Like, people are often very anxious to just kind of make the first bit of their game because they want a tutorial that people can play and play their game and give them feedback or wishlist their game or whatever. And you can't really make that until you've made other parts of the game. So make the middle of your game first. Just work out the fun middle of the game and then backfill the rest of the content is the ideal way of doing it. Your levels form part of a world. What does each level tell us about the world, or what does it create a mystery around? And this could be very broad. It could be, okay, we've got 4 dungeons. One of them is the undead dungeon, one of them is the slime dungeon. It can be that kind of stuff. That still creates a mood of the world. Like making a 4 dungeon roguelike is very different if you're doing it with the Dark Souls IP versus if you're doing it with Adventure Time, right? There are all sorts of decisions about what monsters we put in there, the nature of the puzzles, all of those types of things. Even in a game that is not explicitly telling a story, there are still considerations about what levels do in terms of the world building and so on. What landmarks are there? And can we use like landmarks as big set pieces? There's a crash spaceship in the distance. That's going to help me navigate, but it's also telling me something about what's going on in this world. And the last one, I think, just like, what would you be excited to see in real life? And this is kind of I talked about this. We had a golf game on a while back now that was like a sci-fi golf game where you played a little robot and you played golf and you explored a planet. And one of the things I noticed in that is they had these massive satellite dishes, but rather than use one of them as a landmark, they had placed them all around in the distance. And that was kind of a spectacle in its own right, but just having one massive thing just has a different impact on you versus repeating that massive thing 12 times. It stops working as a navigational tool because there's now 12 identical things in the environment rather than one thing that's a standout thing. And also that standout thing stops being so special. So think about just like baseline. A lot of this, again, I'm being a boring arts and humanities guy and demanding that you think about humans and their minds and their behavior. When you go to a real landmark in the real world, What sorts of things make you feel awe about it? What sorts of things make you go, wow? And it can be like the scale of something. It can be the sense of human craft of like, oh, someone made that. There's all of these things. And when we think about them in relation to level and environment design, none of this is anything that doesn't exist outside of games, right? It's all just stuff that comes from outside of games, that comes from our understanding of architecture, our understanding of like geography and stuff, and then is put in here. And some of it is behavioral stuff to do with how people interpret and move around in a space. But it all predates video games. Seamus asked what the golf game was. It's called Golfer, Golfr. I did a review of it on here, and I think it's fantastic. I had a couple of things I thought they could improve, but it's a really neat sort of Portal type tone to it game where you're doing adventure golf, but you're a little space robot. Really neat. And here's a sort of task I would set you. If you're at the stage where you're making levels for a game, if you could only make 2 very different levels for this game, what would they be, right? And you're assuming that you're eventually going to have more. You're going to have 6 levels. You're going to have 12 levels. But if you had to make a vertical slice for your game that just had 2 levels in it, and you wanted them to, basically you want them to show the extremes of your game, of like the 2 different types of thing that you can do in your game, what would those levels be, right? I think this is a helpful one to think about. So instead of like thinking about the whole game first, maybe you build these 2 levels as like extreme sort of flag posts. Mel said, any advice for a 3D platformer inspired by Journey? It's hard to make exploration cool for my testers with blockouts. They find it boring. I think Journey is a very difficult game to base an indie game on. I think Journey had a lot of hype built up around it at the time. If you look at the historical hype for Journey, a lot of it was coming from like people that like the games are art crowd, and people that wanted to be able to show that you could have a game with no violence in it, and you can have a game with no violence in it. But I don't know. I think Journey is a very beautiful game. I don't think it's a very fun game. And I think if you are in the indie space and you want to make games that people like and play, then you should be aiming for fun first and foremost, or some sort of emotional response to the thing. And just making something that's visually beautiful is kind of like, well, you might as well just be making animations then rather than something interactive. You might as well make like 3D animated music videos for artists or something like that. So I don't really know how to make a Journey type game fun, but then I also just don't think that Journey is fun. And I think a lot of what makes Journey kind of likable to people is to do with the budget that's gone into the art and everything for it. So yeah, exactly. Sub-Zero just said in the chat, exactly. It always looks beautiful, right? And so I think some of this comes down to when you build a game and you assess what you're going to make. Like I have dozens of ideas for games. Like some of them are just filed away from years ago. And when I decide to make a game, I base what I choose to make on what I'm capable of in terms of my hard skills. So there are loads of games that I would like to be able to make, and some of them I just put in the fridge because I can't make them yet. A game like Journey, incredibly dependent on your ability to make beautiful locations and art, and all of the opposite of what we've been talking about here, really. And I think Journey is almost a game that gets away with being a bit boring just because it's so pretty. And I'm not saying that as a cuss to Journey necessarily, but yeah. Buffin Django said, tips or guidance on designing procedural levels? Have a set of... Right, so I think the trick is you're still designing the procedure, right? So if you read Derek Hughes' book about Spelunky, I did an episode of the podcast about it. If you look on podcasts on the channel, you'll find it. He talks about what the rules of the level generation procedure are in Spelunky and what they're trying to achieve, right? So it's very similar to what I talked about earlier with John Romero's level design rules. They're not just arbitrary rules. They're not rules to create a realistic looking place. They are rules to create a certain type of player experience. So the rules in Spelunky are that you have to be able to get from the start to the finish of the level without using any bombs, right? So you have to be able to there are bombs that allow you to destroy the environment. There are ropes that allow you to climb back up. And those things are used to access things off of the golden path. So you've got a level that's divided up into like 9 chunks or 12 chunks or something. You always start on the top row and you always go to the bottom, right? And that's part of the level design thinking that just makes the levels easier to generate because you don't have to worry about whether the player can climb back up. The player is going from the top to the bottom on a sort of golden path of rooms that definitely connect. And then the rest of the rooms can be whatever. And the point is that if you're making a game with procedural generation, that's the kind of thinking you need to do. You need to work out like, what are the kind of set of rules that need to happen in every level? Okay, I never want the level to be blocked. Maybe I want there to be an alternate route and stuff like that. I think the thing that people don't get about procedural generation is that the procedure is what you decide the computer needs to do to make the level, and that procedure shouldn't just be generate a bunch of stuff that looks like caves, right? If you want the level to be fun to play, you need to think about that stuff first and then design the procedure based on that, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Oh yeah, I mean, people defending Journey now. Like, I don't have any beef with Journey. I just didn't find it interesting enough to play for very long. But again, it's kind of, there are certain types of games that I just don't think are very reasonable for indies to expect themselves to be able to do. I played a game called Fade a couple of months ago that was a Souls-like action RPG, and the level of polish that you need to put into the combat to make those feel good is so high. And it was just like, yeah, they'd made a very pretty... It's cruel to call it a screensaver because it did have combat that was playable, but it just wasn't good enough to make me not want to just play Dark Souls or Fable instead, you know? It can be tested separately from the art, but what's the point if you're never going to make the art be to the standard that kind of game needs, right? That's what I'm getting at. When you decide what game to make, like, unless you're in a position where you can hire people to do other parts of the game, the type of game you decide to make should be based on what skills you know you have, right? And something like Journey, if you're making that as a solo developer, you need to be very good at making varied environmental art. You need to be very good at technical art stuff like shaders and like environmental ambience and stuff like that. And even then, you sort of end up making a game like Gris, which people complained about just didn't have anything to do in it. But yeah, procedurality is a whole other thing, and I think that the trick with procedural level generation is just to remind yourself that you're making something for people to play. You're not making a random space, right? And your choice of environment can still help out there, because if you procedurally generate a cave system, it doesn't matter so much if it's if it's generated in a weird way to facilitate gameplay. Whereas if you procedurally generate a tower block or something like that, people have expectations that come from reality. It is hard to know what you can actually do, yeah. And this is why I'm constantly asking people to be honest with themselves about why they're making something. I don't think it's reasonable in most media to expect your learning projects to be commercially viable projects. It's just a lucky accident that happens in games sometimes, and in music sometimes. And we're all learning new stuff all the time, right? But when you get to the point where you want to start taking things to market, then there's a ratio, right? I've imagine like a pie chart, and there's a percentage of it that is new stuff that you're learning for the project, and there's a percentage of it that is stuff you already know how to do. When you are trying to do game development as a career, or when you're making a game and you want to sell it to people, the pie chart should be weighted more towards stuff you know how to do and less towards learning new things. A werewolf not living up to your name. But I mean, think of the successful indie developers you know. Like, I don't know, Ed McMillan, right? Binding of Isaac, Super Meat Boy. Those are games that really use his strengths. He's a comic book artist. He made Flash games. He doesn't just suddenly decide to make a 3D game. I mean, he probably has at some point. But that's a luxury you can afford yourself later on when you've done a few successful things, right? You do successful things by doing what you're good at. And then if they're successful and you buy yourself some time, then you can start branching out into stuff that you want to do. But maybe can't do yet because you can like hire people to help you with it and stuff like that. I will kill everyone's dreams. I'm coming for all of your dreams. No young people watch this channel. 95% of the audience of this channel are over 25. Yeah, you can afford to make Super Meat Boy 3D when you've been making successful stuff for a long time, and you can hire other people to do the 3D stuff. All of your dreams. Murdered. 15-year-olds aren't allowed to watch my channel. I need to change the settings. It's really interesting how sensitive people are to me being harsh on here, I've noticed. And I think it's partly who we get on YouTube, and it's partly the culture that has developed around game development on here as well, of it being like all encouragement. It's all encouragement to get into it rather than to do it well. And at some point you have to have space as well for how to do something well when you're already doing it, you know? Can I do a poll? Okay, I'm going to use very established age ranges. Sorry, I can't operate the poll function in this. Look what it's doing. There we go. So here are the age ranges you can vote for. You are a tiny baby. You are 19 to 13, which is called a foolish young'un. Or you are a wise elder. Those are the three age brackets that exist in the world. Mostly wise elders. Kitten is upset because Kitten is 100 years old and feels excluded. Too much positivity gave me trust issues about people not telling me when something is wrong with my projects. That's yeah, that's definitely relatable. It's interesting, isn't it? It really fundamentally comes down to why people are doing something, and I think most of us who are genuinely want to get better at something, um, it's just a fundamentally different type of psychology of like you engage with people and show them your stuff because you want to make it better, and maybe you want some praise. We all want some praise, but yeah, people lying to you because they are trying to be polite, and that tends to happen much more when you show things to normies who aren't creatives, right? Creatives tend to be more critical of each other's work because we know that even, like if someone sends me a song and I have like a particular part of it I don't like, I'll talk about like, why did you do this bit, da 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 da. And they might be bothered that I don't like it, but at least we're having a technical discussion about making music and they're happy with that rather than just someone go, oh yeah, it's nice. Talk Rack, that just sounds like a game that doesn't have a level in, so you don't need to design it, which is good. Not all games have levels. Oh, woof. I really do think sometimes it is a international culture thing. Because I had this thing with dream games as well when I was talking about dream games before, and it just felt like such a aspirational American culture thing to be talking about your dreams all the time. I even feel the same way about when people talk about their journey. And I'm sorry if this is going to ruin this word for people, but when people talk about their game dev journey or their creative journey or something like that, it's like, I don't know, I don't have a journey or dreams, or I just have habits. I have things I want to do and I have habits, and sometimes my habits are more in line with my goals, and that's a good time, and sometimes my habits aren't, so that I'm, if I have a week where all I do is play video games, then that's me having bad habits. And if I have a week where I make stuff and I tinker and I make progress on the things I'm making, then those are good habits. And like nearly everyone I know who is a professional creative in some way has that orientation to their craft. Their orientation to their craft isn't like, I have a dream. That kind of talk is what people have to do to engage people who aren't really that interested in it, which is why whenever you watch X Factor or American Idol or something, it's never people talking about what they technically do to practice. It's about their dream and how things matter to them and their family, and like it's never about the actual craft of what they're doing, because a general audience, it's not because that's not what they care about. It's because a general audience, when you're making media for a general audience and it's about making art or making music or making games, it can't really be about the craft, because if people were interested in the craft, they'd be doing it too. But they're not interested in the craft, which is why they're a general audience. So if you make anything that you're trying to get like 100,000 people to consume, it can't actually be about the intricacies of doing the actual thing, because most people aren't interested enough in that. Like the closest we get to that is like something like, when Stephen King writes a book and the main character is a writer and he gets to write loads about writing. But we're not Stephen King, I guess. Claim said, I don't have a dream, just screaming ideas that can't stop until they're born. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it often. It's like, it's, I don't want to be like a fake humble, like, nonsense guy, but it's like, it's not about me. It's about the bit that's about me is like, I enjoy doing these things. I enjoy making something. I enjoy improving something. I enjoy the craft. But the thing I'm really excited about is the thing that I can imagine and that I could imagine existing if I bothered to make it exist. That's the thing I'm excited about. And it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's a product of me and my tastes and my experiences and stuff like that. But trying to sort of individualize art into just always being about the artist, it's just so it's kind of relevant if you're making very expressive stuff like music or really personal interactive fiction or something like that. But most of the time with games, we're invisible. We're not there going, hey, play my, it's like the game exists without you and will continue to exist without you, you know. My game dev journey is to make my dream game Devlog 1. Yeah, someone's first session in Unity is not fun content. I did that with Godot about 9 months ago on the channel. I just opened up Godot and went around in all the tutorial projects and got confused and lost. And I think it was funny content because people just like watching me be crap at stuff. But yeah, that's not what your first devlog should be. No tiny babies in the chat today. 36% foolish younguns and 63% wise elders. And sorry if you're 100 years old or older, I'm sorry that I excluded you. Seamus is just living in a David Lynch movie, apparently. I'm just scrolling back and just chuckling at the fact that chuckling at the fact that the chat is just now like a dozen people going, I don't have dreams. Yeah, I don't have dreams either. Dreams suck. Sub-Zero said, have you considered opening some games and just explaining things like level design? So when this channel is operating at a level when I can do it as a full-time job, which is not a hint, by the way, because everyone who is here in the chat, whether you're a member or not, is helping to support this channel. But once we kind of reach a point where the channel is making enough money for this to be my full-time job, then I would like to do some of what you're describing. Because at the moment we do everything in streams, or most of what I do is in streams now. And part of that is just that I'm lonely and I like talking to you. I like that aspect. But also doing like edited videos that are very structured and get to the point very quickly is just really time consuming, and the amount of time you put into it versus what you get back in terms of views or finance or anything is incredibly low. So it's just better to do streams and cut them down, which is, you know, like the pirate software way of doing things, I guess. Feel free to boo if you want to. I don't have a dog in that fight. But what I'm trying to get to, what I would like to do, Sub-Zero, is eventually get to a point where I can go back to old games we've covered and I can do like a proper polished video on a topic, like common UI problems that games have, and then I can go through existing games, pause the footage, you know, green screen in front of it with a decent green screen that isn't the crap one off my camera, and like just do something much more focused and structured using examples of games that have previously been on the channel. I would love to be able to do that. It's just, I think doing that kind of content is going to be really, really time consuming, and I need to be able to do it properly. You know, I started the channel doing that kind of stuff, doing deep dives on one topic and like one game and stuff like that, and I want to go back to doing that, but it's just not kind of cost effective in terms of the time investment, I guess. Lawyer, I totally agree with you. Being naive and failing overscope projects is fine as long as you keep making games and having fun in the process. Yeah, I did a video recently about scope and project scope, and I talked about this. It's like if you make one massive messy game that's a mess versus 10 little scrappy game jam prototypes, as long as you learned the same amount in those times, nothing is better. Like the way that we talk about scope is very much a product of a lot of game developer discourse being focused on people cosplaying as professionals when they're not yet really. And it's like you'll get like, you know, game dev dudes doing a podcast who will talk about scope loads, and it's like, well, that is relevant in most cases when you're trying to actually make and release a finished game, but for a lot of people when they're just working on hobby projects and learning how to do something, then I don't think scope is really that relevant a concept. Just make a thing until you get bored of it and then make something else. It's fine. Wheelie Bin, do you think a background in architecture is a viable start to transition into games? Yeah, very much so. Just don't try and do everything. You know, if you can find a context where you can do the stuff from architecture that you're interested in games, right? You used to, I mean, you still can. You can enter level design jams and just use a level editor without making a whole game. And then if you want to make a whole game, you can come to that later on. Larry, I think the review of Twisted Tower is still up. So I set videos to members only when I want to take them down, because I don't do any special content that's members only. It's just when I have a video I don't really want and I want to take it down, I set it to members only instead. There is a review of Twisted Tower. The one that is members only is just the original stream with no editing, but the video exists. It's just, I think what you're experiencing probably is YouTube pushing all the members only stuff to try and make you get a membership. I would say, very grateful to everyone who is a member, but I don't make specifically members only stuff to try and allure people into becoming channel members. It is just there because I took it down, and that's because there was an edited version that was a much kind of cleaner and got to the point more, because the streams of me playing the game, it's just me saying the same thing over and over again. Yeah. Yeah, controlling scope, Maxime, I agree. It can be important to do at the start just to make sure you finish the thing. But I mean, the best way to do that is just to make jam games at the start, because you can't help but control the scope then, because there's a deadline, right? Having deadlines is so important whatever you're working on. If you're working on a big game or a small game, one of the reasons why I encourage people to take their games to events and meetups and stuff like that is it creates a cadence of like, I need to get my game in this state before this date. I literally just started a local meetup. It's just like, there are two towns near me, and there is like a trendy pub in both of those, and I've created a meetup that happens in one month and then the other in the other month, and we've scheduled it to December. There might only be 4 or 5 people that show up who make games or are interested in games, but it means that I've always got a mini deadline for myself. So if I'm working on a longer project, it's something that I can schedule my project around, you know. And one of the dangers of working on your own entirely on the internet is just never having a deadline for anything. The only free stuff you get is you get the Discord, and you get the incredible range of deluxe emojis from the good old days when I used to dress up more. Right, we're going to round it up in a second. Thanks to everyone who joined. This has been a bit of a weird one for me because I sort of thought I don't really want to talk about this subject because I'm not a specialist in it. And then I thought, oh, hang on, I am more of a specialist in it than most people that do game dev content on here. I've just forgot because I haven't done level design for a year or two, you know? Like 18 months ago, I was doing level design on this Blackpink Roblox game that's been played by like hundreds of thousands of people, and I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm not a level designer. It's like, what? Wheelie Bin, considering a master's in game design, do you think they're worthwhile for connections and such, or is it better to develop your skills and slowly build a portfolio in your free time? Okay. My recommendation, if you are looking to join, so someone in the chat, sorry, I'm going to frame this in a certain way so I can cut it down and make a video about it. Sorry, Wheelie, this is just how these things work. Someone in the chat said they're considering a master's degree in game design. Do you think they're worthwhile for connections, or is it just better to develop your skills and slowly build a portfolio in your free time? It's always better to practice a thing by just doing the thing. And someone who has a really good portfolio is always more likely to get a job than someone who has a degree but their portfolio is a bit rubbish, or their portfolio is just sort of stuff they were forced to do on their course. So I would say even if you're considering doing something like a master's degree, you should be doing the thing already. In terms of the specific masters you do, one of the things you should do to vet the course is just look at how much they share what their students create. So my criteria for whether a master's course in game design or game development anywhere is any good is stuff like, does the course put on public events where the public play the games of the students? Does the course have a itch profile where they post the games of the students? If they don't have those things, if they don't do anything publicly to show off the games or to show how good they are or anything like that, they don't make a fuss about it, they're probably not doing very well at the networking side of things either. And you're not going to get those kind of networking opportunities that you mentioned. So that would be the thing I would look at in terms of the specific course, the specific institution. If they don't do those things, if you can't see like news articles where it's like game developers from this place take their games to this show or something like that, if you can't see that they've got an itch profile and they're showcasing the games, either they're not very proud of them because the students are making very good games. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be that the staff aren't very good and aren't teaching them. Or it could be that the course is like loaded up with students who don't have any background in that thing. So they come in with zero skills and then they do a master's and they can only make baby's first game by the end of it. That can happen as well. But it could be that if you can't see this stuff, the staff or the institution are not particularly proud of the games. They think they don't reflect well on the course. Or it's more likely that they just don't have a very good culture there of networking and sharing. They don't have any connections to industry. They don't put on any events or go to any events. And if that's the case, then those things are red flags and I would avoid that course entirely. So I don't think, cost aside, I don't think any education is ever wasted. You usually get something out of it, even if certain bits of it are bad. But those are the things I would advise you do if you are deciding to go down that route in order to vet the course and make sure you don't end up on a bad one, because there are some bad ones out there. Right. Thanks, folks. I'm going to close up for the day because I am. Because I planned to stream for 2 hours and I've streamed for 2 hours and 13 minutes. And I appreciate you all, and thank you for joining and listening to me ramble about these things. And remember, One day you'll make something good. Maybe.